Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to draw on the example of another business which has sadly had to close down to draw attention to non-tariff barriers with Brexit. Boris Johnson claimed that there were no non-tariff barriers with our Brexit deal with the EU, but the reality is that this and many other businesses have faced not just some non-tariff barriers, but all of them. This business did not close down because of tariffs, didn't even close down because it couldn't supply its customers. When you hear how it did close down, it might bring home just how damaging Brexit is and continues to be. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So I often cite the case of a business struggling due to Brexit in my videos. I feel particularly badly in this case. The owner of a business for 10 years selling lights and lamps, they tweeted a couple of photographs. One was of their business premises full to the brim with all sorts of light fittings. The second was the same shop, stripped bare, closed down. The reason, not because he couldn't manage the Brexit paperwork, not because tariffs on his goods were a problem. In fact, this is a shop in Britain, just a high street shop. His customers were here. So there was no trade barriers between him and his customers at all. He cites the reason for having to close simply being he couldn't be supplied. We're so used to hearing of cases where British exporters are struggling, but it's worth noting that trade barriers work both ways, even though they're a little bit weaker our way. British businesses like this one have struggled with supplies because businesses in the EU have found it just too much hassle to fulfil orders for Britain. Needless to say, he was obviously not able to simply find supplies in the UK. This is an important point to make. The different countries making up the single market, they don't replicate production. In fact, the way the single market works so well is because, you know, if you produce a small amount of a particular product, you can have like one factory in the whole of Europe and it can export basically to the whole of Europe really easily. Incredibly efficient. So there are things being produced, lights and lamps in this case, which for a particular model are only made in Belgium. There's like one company that makes them in Belgium, or one in Germany, or some in Greece. And those producers are used to supplying customers all over Europe. They get an order and they it doesn't matter which country it is into them. There's no difference between are we shipping it to our own country or a neighbouring country. They ship it out. The only paperwork they need is an invoice and a dispatch note, as long as it's going to somewhere else in the single market, which covers the majority of Europe. But then all of a sudden they found that to supply their British customers, they needed to get to grips with onerous customs paperwork. Complicated if you're not used to it. And there was no need to get used to it if you only supplied British customers now and then. Make a mistake, your goods are stuck at the border until the issue is resolved, if it ever gets resolved. And it might take you quite a while to resolve it because now remotely you've got to try and work out what you did wrong or how to put it right. A lot of hassle for the sake of a smaller market that some suppliers can just do without. There will be some goods which Britain buys from EU producers in sufficiently large quantities that they will put in the effort because it's worth enough money for them to go to that hassle. They may hire a customs expert to manage their orders for Britain. This was obviously a case of lots of suppliers in the EU supplying individual light fittings who didn't supply that much to businesses in Britain like this person and others, and just didn't think it was worth it. So they stopped supplying. Sorry, we cannot justify the time and aggro with dealing with this paperwork, which we've never seen in our lives. And so without being able to source enough stock, the shop had to close down. Another business gone, heartache for the owner, and our tax revenues fall a little bit lower, our GDP taking another knock, and, you know, consumers in this country have a bit less choice. And imagine just how many small businesses, which make up the bulk of our employment, remember, imagine how many businesses have found themselves in the same situation. Brexit screwing them over, not because they can't handle the paperwork and certainly not tariffs, just the other market not wanting to put up with it. So it's worth going back to what Boris Johnson said Brexit would be like. He said there would be no non-tariff barriers for trade with the EU after Brexit. So what are non-tariff barriers, or NTBs? Well, the obvious response is to say that it's any barrier to trade which is not tariffs. But there are specifics. The main non-tariff barriers are, first, quotas. If there are limits on how much of certain products you're allowed to export to the market in question, the single market in this case, then that is a non-tariff barrier. So do the EU apply quotas to our exports? After all, Boris Johnson said it was a quota-free deal. Well, not quite. If the goods meet rules of origin, that is, they meet the requirements to be classed as having been essentially produced in the UK, then yes, there are no quotas. However, in order to show that it meets rules of origin, you need to complete the paperwork to prove it. That can be tricky because you might need documentation from suppliers outside the UK who can't be asked to provide it. But if you can gather all that paperwork together, then okay, there are no quotas. However, because getting the paperwork together is a bit of a task, and not always an easy one, if a supplier will not supply you with the documentation you want, because they don't have to, then you have an NTB right there. The hassle of paperwork is sometimes a barrier to trade. But if you can't prove rules of origin, or your product doesn't meet rules of origin, in other words, you've bought the components from all over the world and manufactured something in Britain, but there's not enough of it classed as being made in Britain, then the quotas are in force. A second type of NTB would be those rules of origin themselves, because you need to hit these not just to avoid quotas, but to avoid tariffs as well. So even if your goods do meet the requirements, because you have to prove it, and because you might not be able to prove it, because like a supplier overseas can't be bothered to go to all the hassle of helping you out, then this is also a separate NTB. And even if you can eventually prove it, it still takes time and therefore expense to gather together the paperwork necessary to prove it. Third would be standards. Obviously, you need to produce goods that meet the standards of the market in which you're selling them. Now, obviously, that was the case before Brexit for sales in the EU as well. What's changed here is that you need paperwork proving it. Because when we were part of the single market, all British producers were required to maintain certain standards, and inspections would take place to ensure compliance. Now, British and EU businesses are in different markets with different standards. So each needs the paperwork to prove that despite the different standards their government now allows them to adhere to, that they have nonetheless met the standards in the export market. These are non-tariff barriers. Basically, they take the form of red tape of one kind or another, and it's not just that some of these apply to our trade with the EU, all of them apply to all businesses wishing to enter, to either import from or export to the EU. We do have quotas on some goods produced in Britain. We do have tariffs on some goods produced in Britain. Rules of origin, if you don't want the quotas and tariffs to apply, you have to sort that out. That is still a barrier to trade. Didn't have to do it. You still have to prove that your goods meet certain standards to be able to be sold into the single market. And this is the future. This is not only going to carry on putting businesses out of business, it stops new ones setting up in the first place. So what's the solution? Well, if you want to get rid of quotas, tariffs and rules of origin, you need to join a customs union. If we join a customs union with the EU, overnight, there's no need for customs paperwork, customs checks. No need to deal with rules of origin, no need to worry about tariffs or quotas. It all goes away. It would be relatively straightforward, assuming the EU is interested in negotiating a customs union with us. I suspect they might want to make sure that it's politically settled first. The Conservatives could be a barrier to it. But what's the drawback? Well, we have to apply the EU's tariff regime to third countries around the world. The way a customs union works, the way you have no customs procedures inside the market and you, as the country in the customs union, there has to effectively be an external border around all of you with respect to other third countries. That is not a particular problem. However, it does take away some bargaining power when you're trying to negotiate trade deals with other third countries. That being said, you know, if you look at, we've had 4 trade deals, never mind, 70 odd trade deals. No, almost every trade deal we've got with the country around the world is our EU trade deal that we just scrubbed out EU and put UK in instead. They're copied versions. We have 4 genuine trade deals since Brexit, and they've all been crap, every single one of them. And when we do start to negotiate more seriously, as we've tried to recently, we end up having to accept that actually it's going to take a while. We're finding that with Canada, we're finding it a little bit with India. But long term, you could certainly argue that customs union membership hampers future trade deals. Also, it would mean that some third countries would get tariff-free trade with us because of their EU trade deals, but we might not get it reciprocated with them if we don't have the same deal ourselves. However, that is largely a hypothetical issue because most of our trade deals are the same as the ones we had as EU members. We just don't get the benefits of their enhanced deals since we left. But it is still a theoretical drawback in the long term. So what do you do about that? Well, if there's an easy way to join the single market in the next 10 years, as there might well be, then that would also solve that problem, because we'd be getting fully upgraded EU trade deals, and we would abolish the final non-tariff barrier as well, having to prove that we meet the standards of the EU single market. So that would be how we deal with this if we were serious about maximising our economic growth. Or we could just carry on as we are, heads in the sand, coming up with excuses when more businesses fail, or as the number of new startups carries on bottom feeding. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.